Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back to The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook. Happy to be here with you for episode 37, and this is one that I have been looking forward to for quite some time. About 6-7 months ago, I happened to have stumbled on an article about COVID and collecting, and that is why so many people were drawn into collecting during that time. And there was a quote in there from a Dr. Shirley Mueller that I was really fascinated by. And I started looking her up a bit more and realizing she's done a number of articles for esteemed publications throughout the country, including Psychology Today, and actually wrote a book. The book is called Inside the Head of a Collector, Neuropsychological Forces at Play. I picked up a copy of this and I couldn't put it down. I've actually read it twice now, and it is one of the most incredible insights into the minds of collectors. And that is relating, I would guess, to what is the process of the mind, what in the mind and the neuroscience and the science background of the mind that creates some of the decision making and some of the aversion and some of the emotions that collectors feel, right down to very much why they collect. So this book, while I was reading through it and I recognized all the signs of collectors and all the things that she perfectly identified and the traits and trends that you see in collectors over their evolution. What this book laid out for me was the idea of what inside the mind actually creates this, because it's kind of like an engine, I guess. You know what happens when you hit the gas pedal? The car goes forward. You know what happens when you hit the brakes? You stop. But she really goes deep into the mechanics of the mind, and I think really helps collectors see themselves in a way that could be enlightening and in a way that I think will help them in their collecting in the future by being able to recognize what is happening in the process of their decision making. So Dr. Mueller is not just all of these things, researcher, writer, scientist, psychiatrist, neurologist, but she's a collector. And in that, she really gets it. And she uses her own case examples throughout the book to talk about some of these different things and different science behind it and her own experiences as a collector, her pitfalls, her successes, and breaks them all down for every collector to learn from. Dr. Mueller, thank you so much for being with us here today on The Curious Collector. And I know a lot of people are going to be very excited to learn about themselves as collectors. And I'm glad you could join us.
I am very happy to be here, Stuart. I want to say that a lot of the principles that we'll talk about today having to do with collecting apply to life in general. So I think carrying some of these concepts with the collector will help him or her actually do a better job of living.
I love that. Collecting is a metaphor for life.
Yes, exactly. That's true. It's so perfect because, we go to work. Some of us don't enjoy our work. We come home and there might be dishes to wash or meals to prepare or whatever. But with collecting, the collector can control what he or she collects. Furthermore, the collector can decide where it will go in the house, what shelves it'll go on, how to display it, and can interact with other collectors about the chosen item that each collects. So it has so many social benefits as well as taking the collector out of his/her usual realm, because we can control it as collectors. There are very few things in life we can control. This is one.
It's so fascinating to me because you're saying such positive things about collecting, which are often, I think, missed by, I like to call them the others. That is, the people who don't collect. And I think you and I probably agree. I think the statistics are about 40% of the country considers themselves collectors of some sort. And so that leaves 60% of the country that are non-collectors. And I always find they don't get it. And your background and your expertise as a neurologist and someone who has studied this, and more importantly, as a collector, you are allowing an opportunity for the others to see, oh, wow, what they're doing is actually really positive. It's not just a passing fancy or a whim. It's something really beautiful. And I think that was a great intro you just gave, and I thank you for that. So can you share with the listeners today a little bit about your background, both as a collector and as a neurologist, and how this all intersected in your experiences and where this all began?
This all began in 1989 or 1990. I was a physician working very hard, probably 80 hours a week, and I was exhausted, and I just needed something to take me out of my usual workday. And for some reason, I saw a book about Chinese porcelain, which is what I collect, and I just fell in love with it from the book. And then I started going to meetings about Chinese porcelain, joined groups, began to buy, and I was lucky to put all those things on my shelf because it gave me a sense of ownership, and I could put them where I wanted. I can remember one time my husband was at a bachelor party, and he was gone until 2 a.m. And I rearranged all my porcelain that whole time from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. And it gave me such satisfaction. So I think I have really gotten a lot out of this. But I want to tell you really why I turned to a hobby like porcelain. I just needed something different, as I said before, but I needed the world to be open to me. And collecting does that. Collectors can travel to see their chosen pieces. They can join clubs and thereby get to know other people. They can even go to auctions, which are mostly online these days. But again, it's a way of honing down their expertise in their chosen area. So for ever so many years, that's what I did. I do it less now because as an older collector, I do have to decide what to do with my collection, which is wrenching. I think if anyone is listening who's over 60 or 70, he or she will find it so. I even wrote an article about it when I sold at Christie's and Sotheby's in New York. At Christie's, my pieces didn't sell quickly, which often happens. People will wait until the end to bid. But I was a nervous wreck. And my husband said to me, you can't go through this because I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. But finally, my pieces did sell. So I was okay. At Sotheby's, it turned out better. They sold more quickly, so I didn't have that angst.
So the anxiety of a seller. Well, you know, there is a solution for that, Dr. Mueller. It is very simple. You just don't sell them.
Take a pill?
Well, there's that.
Okay.
But don't sell them and let your kids deal with them. You know, a lot of collectors will tell me, oh, I can't leave this mess for my family to deal with. I've got to deal with it myself. And I always say, no, leave it for them to deal with. It's revenge on them for their teenage years.
Right. Well, I think that is one way. But I also think that the owner, the collector, knows where these pieces can go better than the kids. Of course, most collectors want to give pieces to the kids if the kids want them. But I feel an obligation to my pieces that they go to a good home. So I felt like at Sotheby's and Christie's, they would go to good homes. And now I'm actually looking for a private collector who will, again, give my remainder a place to rest indefinitely.
You bring up such a great point, and something that I talk about a lot of times with collectors is that I've always believed in my analysis over the years and working with collectors all over the world is that self-preservation in many cases is very much at the root of this, that your collection is an extension of you. And as such, the greatest anxiety or fear of any collector is, where will they go when I'm gone? Because they're carrying your story. They're carrying part of you. And so that is always the fear of different collectors you hear about. Well, will there be anybody left to collect these when it's time to move on? And your anxieties I have seen in a number of collectors. So I'm curious, you're a neurologist. You have
Correct.
an understanding of the mind, the science of the mind, I guess we could say. Was there a certain point during your collecting that you started realizing, wait a minute, I need to start analyzing a little bit of myself and what I'm doing and what's behind this?
Absolutely. I found that I was doing irrational thinking about collecting.
Okay. Well, isn't that part of collecting?
It doesn't have to be as much as it is. So I thought somebody needs to put pen to paper and tell other people what I've discovered about myself, which I think applies to others who collect. That we do it because we seek pleasure. We select a particular area because of our background, our experiences, to a certain degree, our genetics, and how we were raised. And I found that with every collector I've ever encountered, if we will sit down for a half an hour and talk about why they collect their particular pieces, they will come up with something. The dolls are interesting. You deal with a lot of people who collect dolls, and they must have their stories, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And you've identified already a number of the different benefits that certain people find, 40% of our country find in the area of collecting. And that is building community, the experiences of traveling, the experience of ownership, and the aesthetic. But I've also noticed, and helped me understand this, especially in the case of dolls, nostalgia is a massive trigger to collecting. It's not a return to childhood necessarily. It's a return to something past that maybe you grew up with, but it then expands from there. In our case in dolls, the gateway for a lot of collectors is collecting something out of their youth. Then it grows, and next thing you know, they're collecting French bébés, high-end French bébés and poupées, fashion dolls from the 1860s and 70s. But is there science behind nostalgia?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, actually. And I think that's part of the background and experiences that people want to recreate. For example, there was a young man who started collecting Japanese porcelain. And when asked about why he did that, it was because he took a class from a professor who was Japanese and had a collection. And he admired this professor, so he decided to do it, and that looked back to his experience. In a way, that's nostalgia because he enjoyed being in class with this particular professor. So it plays a very important part. I'm so glad you mentioned it.
Very interesting. One of the things I've noticed too, and we're kind of starting this off with the why people collect. I did a survey of a number of collectors, and this obviously was doll focused. And one of the interesting commonalities I found between a number of them was in their very formative years of, let's call it 4 years old to 9 years old. They were in households, parents who took them to museums or took them to antique shows or flea markets or antique shops. And they were very involved in collecting or even just admiring old objects. The ones who the parents did it when they were teenagers didn't really resonate, but when they were younger, it stuck with them. And there was a nostalgia. You mentioned this collector of Japanese porcelain, that nostalgia to something of the past, not necessarily the item itself that they grew up with, but they were influenced and exposed to these things at a younger age and later on became collectors of them.
What percentage of the collectors of dolls that you interviewed gave the history consistent with what you're saying?
It was like 50% of them had some direct connection to their youth and growing up with parents who exposed them at a young age to old objects.
That makes perfect sense. I did a paper once on child collectors, and they didn't collect dolls necessarily. Mm-hmm. They were young collectors, so they collected rocks and whatever small thing that they could get inexpensively. But I was so struck one time by a child who gave this story that he collected because his parents were gone a lot and it gave him something to do. And I thought, that's a reason to collect. And it was a constructive reason to collect.
Well, it's interesting you brought up younger collectors because I don't know about in your field of Chinese export porcelain, but in our field, one of the big things you hear collectors always say is, why are there not more young collectors? You know, look, we're all getting older. And I always say, well, you know, it's been like that for every generation. It's just one generation of 50-plus-year-olds replacing the next one. And that people collect typically when they're older. Nostalgia really kicks in when you get older. And I always use the music analogy is that it seems like you hit a certain age where you stop listening to new music. You're then listening to mostly older music. And that's nostalgia, going back to your younger days. So I think it's the same way with collecting. But Dr. Mueller, I want to go in a little bit to your book and some of the things, because you mentioned this earlier with the idea that self-awareness in your collecting, that is understanding the triggers, the mind, and what influences you, can help you to, A, be a better collector if you understand them. And from what I achieved in reading this book twice, by the way, is that in the process, you'll have a better time. You'll alleviate some of the anxieties that you even say you have occasionally over your collecting, and it will make for a better experience overall. So I want to talk about one right away that you actually started the book off with, and I think is such a great conversation to have. And that is collecting and the idea of risk taking versus the common thing that you will see with some collectors, and that is risk aversion. Can you fill us in a little bit more about that and your work in researching this?
I think to take a risk, a collector needs a certain amount of money. So if a mistake is made, he or she can absorb the loss. But in terms of being risk averse, it tends to be more women than men, just like with finance. Women tend not to take as many risks as men, so their portfolios will be more conservative. So one would think that women's collecting items would be more conservative, but that's not necessarily the case. It depends on, I think, the wealth of the woman. There are fewer women collectors than men, at least broadly, maybe not of dolls. But it is the wealthy women who are able to make a mistake, just like it's a wealthy man who can make a mistake. I think people who are kind of strapped for cash, so to speak, want to be more conservative for good reason, probably. You know, the worst thing that can happen in my mind, and I've seen this happen, is that one person in a couple is a collector. Let's say it's a woman who collects dolls, and her husband doesn't, and he is just livid about the money that she spends. And it actually causes lots of marital problems. People have actually asked me, how can we get over this? One way would be to make more money, and the other way would be for the husband to start collecting too.
Can I just interject here and give you some statistics on our part from the doll idea, because I think you'll find it interesting. 94% of doll collectors around the world are women. So it is a vast majority. What has changed is what you just described is previous generations, you tended to have the opposing forces of the husband who didn't like it and the woman who was sneaking the dolls in the house. It used to be, honestly, skimming the grocery money. That was the doll market of the 70s, that early period. That has evolved. And I have really pushed for the idea of husbands validating their wives in their collecting and helping them see that this is a positive thing, because it's really important, especially for the female collector, to have that validation from their partner, not just from the financial standpoint, but what you touched on, which is what I have been talking about. Women are less risk takers in general, I've noticed, and in years of working with women across the world. Men, and you see this at the auctions, if you have your husband there, I always see the bidding will be far more robust. I'll tell you this story. And I think this leads to the idea of women are very pragmatic. And I was auctioning a piece. It got up to about $40,000 or $50,000 for this French bébé. And the woman bidding on it, she just stopped and she yelled to her husband who was sitting next to her, but everybody could hear it. That's it. I'm done. I am not paying more for a doll than I did for my first house. So the whole crowd burst out laughing. But guess what happened? The husband looked at her and he started bidding. And this is why, you know, the world record price for a doll is $335,000, which you think is phenomenal. But in the reality of it, for a three-dimensional figurative piece of art, in the case of this particular doll, it is nothing when you see comic books bringing 7 million, baseball cards, 10, 11 million, stamps, coins, all up into the many millions, collector cars, 130 million. And so men, they are the risk takers. in the collecting world, is what you're saying.
Right.
So where is the answer? Should you be risk aversive? Should you be a risk taker?
Either one. I think it depends on your level of comfort, essentially. There are some women who are risk takers, but many fewer than men in general. So we'll see a whole spectrum. But taking a risk can be measured. What is collected can be studied, can be taught, can be run by other people, ask their opinion. Dealers have been so helpful, I think, to many collectors, and I dare say even auctioneers, probably, when they talk out of the podium. But in general, yes, it is women who are more conservative.
It seems to, if you're attempting to manage it in yourself as a collector, it seems the answer is probably in the middle. Risk take, but do it with critical thinking and have that risk aversion in the back of your mind to keep yourself from making mistakes, because you talk a lot about mistakes in this book and the effect of those mistakes as a collector on the mind. You called it actually anterior insula. And that really fascinated me because I never thought of it in this manner. You talked about how the pain of mistakes is actually more powerful than the reward of dopamine.
That is the case, Stuart. An example might be in an auction. Although we used to think that people bid to win, winner's curse, so-called, because people would bid up, and then the curse was they got the object at a high price. In reality, it's been shown at an auction that people bid because they don't want to lose, because the pain of losing is so great, more than the pleasure of winning. So I think that just demonstrates the point. And in life, that is true too. We just don't want to lose. We don't want the negative because it pains us more. And I have a chart in the book which I think shows that pretty dramatically. Loss, it goes negative on the chart to a very high degree, and winning goes up to a lesser degree than the loss goes down.
It was one of the things that I was absolutely fascinated by in the book. I always just assumed it was dopamine. That's it. It's that reward of dopamine. And I guess there's an element to it, but there's science behind this. It's not just speculation. There's real science behind this to show that it's the fear of loss that drives us more than the desire to win.
Correct. Yeah. And it's the insula that gets into play there.
But dopamine is a part of it.
Oh my gosh, yes. Pleasure. We are all seeking pleasure. For collectors, finding a unique piece or a piece that they don't have is just incredible pleasure. And that's because of dopamine. But the interesting thing is that the dopamine surge in the nucleus accumbens, which is a pleasure center, is greatest as we anticipate obtaining an object rather than when we actually obtain it. So this is the situation. Collectors always remain collectors because they're always looking for that dopamine hit. And how do they get that dopamine hit? They anticipate and look for the next best thing. Once they have it, then they need another dopamine hit. So they have to go out again and look again for the next beautiful doll or whatever. That's pretty exciting for people that sell objects because they know the collectors will be coming back again and again. It is a behavioral addiction. It's not an addiction like a drug addiction, cocaine or something. It is actually a behavioral addiction in the brain that we have to have it. It's not that we would like it. We need it. It's serious. And,
is it healthy?
To a certain degree. Some people go over the top and will spend too much money and be away from their family too much. But most collectors are pretty level-headed and do not spend too much and try to involve their family if they can. But the dopamine hit is very important.
One thing that's interesting, I've been studying, I haven't shared this with you, Dr. Mueller, but I've been studying millennials and Gen Z as two generations to kind of look, because I've been fascinated that they are actually becoming very significant collectors at a much younger age than I think any other generation before. And we are experiencing this even in dolls. Now, they collect differently and they collect different things. They're obviously at this point more interested in nostalgia. I know you wrote an article about Labubu, which I'll let you know. I actually have the nation's leading expert on Labubu coming on the podcast in a few weeks. So I'll let you know when that's.
Oh, good.
But you're seeing this. And so I've been analyzing, kind of trying to understand the reasons why that generation, millennials and Gen Z, started collecting at a higher pace and at a younger age than others. And one of the interesting things, I find them to be very empathetic, very protective of the past. I think that they missed out on a lot of consistency in their lives, and there's something really consistent about old objects as well. But the thing that I really zoomed in on was video games. Not collecting of video games, but the playing of video games. As I realized in my analysis, there's an entire collecting world within video games. And you have them with what they call loot boxes and gachapon. And people are collecting and trading within these games. They're starting when they're like 6 or 7 years old and collecting inside of games. And so it all leads to dopamine. They've been having this dopamine hit, as you call it, since they were 7. And now they're coming into their adult years with money, and they're taking that and transferring that need for this dopamine into conventional collecting. Have you seen this, or does it make sense to you?
It makes sense to me. I haven't personally been involved in it because our grandchildren are not in that age group. When they are, it'll be a different story. Getting back to Labubus,
we're going to go back there. Okay.
Yeah, my granddaughter gave Labubu for Christmas, and it is a Labubu, not a Lafufu, because she was able to recognize the false one from the authentic one. Right. But I actually have it attached to my purse. And
oh my gosh,
this is a little odd for a woman my age, but it certainly does provide some interaction for me with others.
Well, perhaps you're moving on from Chinese export porcelain to Labubu as your new collection. So why not?
Exactly.
You do you. That's the great thing about a collector. You do you, whatever it is. I love this. I want to talk about this, and that is what you termed in your book, essentialism. Now, this is another example of how you gave a scientific terminology and the science behind it to a concept that we've all known in collecting, but we never really knew how to explain it. And you do it so perfectly in your book. Essentialism, essentially, no pun intended, being that the story is what draws us into an object. And I long said this, that the item may be beautiful, but it's the story that really gives life to a piece and makes us want it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Essentialism has to do with the item being authentic. For example, if there is a painting at auction and it's supposed to be let's say a Monet, and the buyer takes it home, hangs it on his or her wall, and an expert comes in and says, this is not a Monet, then the buyer feels cheated because the essentialism has to do with Monet himself painting it in a certain light at a certain time, and it reflects then his soul. But the reproduction doesn't reflect the soul of Monet. It's essentially, to many buyers, if they have a reproduction, just cold and unpleasant.
I think it can work in both ways. It's so fascinating. See, I took it in a different manner, and you've explained it in that way. I also looked at it from an idea that a simple object that is not so beautiful, perhaps, or aesthetically pleasing, may be very simple. But if it has a story that people connect to, that this is essentialism as well, or am I getting it wrong?
I would say the piece has to be what it is said to be rather than the story, because we all have stories about our pieces. Every single collector can tell you where he or she purchased it, how much was paid, and how people admire it, and other collectors that have it. So that would be the story, I would say.
I guess I really did have it all wrong, the idea of essentialism, but this is why we have these conversations, because I read the book and took it in a different way, and you've come here and really clarified it for me from a different angle. But in that, we've talked about the stories, and Dr. Mueller, the stories are clearly a really important part of the experience of an object in your life. That part is true, correct?
Absolutely. Recently, I broke a piece. It was on the top of a shelf, and under the shelf there were some drawers. And I was opening the drawer, and it sort of vibrated the shelf, and the piece on it fell on my head. And it was heavy, but that's not the story. The story is that when it was repaired, I was asked to write down how the accident happened and what it meant to me, and to keep it with the piece. And I thought that was such a good idea, because the piece is damaged, but it was expensive and somebody will get it eventually. But to say how it was damaged, which is kind of interesting. I like that concept.
That is so unique. I mean, obviously there's the stories of the past of where that item came from, the hands it may have gone through, but your story too, there's a certain energy from you that follows that object as a result. Is it, as an expert, therapeutic to you as well to write that down?
Yes. This particular accident had a lot of relevance to me because I was giving a dinner party in an hour, and there I was with egg on my head because of this heavy plate falling on my head, and I also had a headache. So I will never forget this accident, which this plate represents.
You were able to have a moment. Obviously, you were upset. Clearly, you weren't happy about it. Like, oh, well, that's great. I broke it. I have a story now. What's the old saying? You made lemonade out of a lemon. And that now becomes part of your story and your history with your objects. And I think that's really a wonderful, positive way to approach it. And that actually leads perfectly into the next topic I wanted to address, because you had a whole chapter on this that was really intriguing to me. And that is protection and pain, the loss of items. Everyone who collects anything fragile, there's always going to be an element of something that occurs. And can you tell the listeners here about this protection and pain and how collectors handle and cope with this loss?
I would say in general poorly, because it is so painful. But you are so right. Anything that is fragile can be broken, and often easily. So in my collecting career, which started in 1989, I gathered over 600 pieces. And I'm not proud of what I'm going to say now, but of those 600 pieces, 26 were broken in one way or another. Coming down the stairs, holding a piece. We did have, believe it or not, an earthquake in our area. I lost 3 pieces then because the shelf shook enough so the pieces fell forward, and in order to open the case, they had to fall out because there was no other way to get them other than to take the whole thing apart, which was impossible. Also, things have broken when I bought them back from Europe. I remember I bought a lovely tea set, very high end, with an armorial on it, and I just didn't want to pay to have it shipped. At that time, we didn't have as much money as we do now as we get older. And I carried it with me, and one of the pieces broke. My husband, of course, told me not to do it, and I haven't done it since. But there are so many ways that breakage can occur, and it just makes your heart beat very fast, and you feel badly about it. Sometimes it's hard to even get out of your mind.
One of the steps, I guess, from your expertise is, as you said, that's therapeutic, is writing that story about the object. If you can still repair it and have it, to write that, and that helps with it. But in some cases, I guess, when the items are broken beyond repair, even that, is there any way to cope with it, or you just accept it as part of the experience of collecting?
I really don't accept it for myself because I am entrusted with these pieces. And at least some of the accidents occurred because I was not as careful as I should have been. For example, carrying a tea set back from Europe rather than paying for professional shipping. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm the custodian, right, and I should be doing a better job, which is one reason why I think of selling sooner rather than later, because there's always a chance of an earthquake again in our area, always a chance of a storm affecting our house or a tornado, God forbid. Mm-hmm. But I guess I would feel better if the most beautiful pieces that are high end were in a museum where there was more protection.
This is, Dr. Mueller, so interesting because I talk about this in a lot of the lectures I do, that in the past, collectors tended to live maybe into their late 70s. And they often stayed in their original homes and they built these big collections. And they were the generation that, and we're going back to like the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is the generation that was like, this is my house. This is the house I'll die in. And the only way I'm leaving my collection in this house is feet first. And so back then, most people lived into their late 70s. And so that was an easy promise to keep. Interestingly, now collectors are living very long lives. I just sat in a living room in Australia recently with a woman who is 108 years old and living in her house with her collection. What we're finding is a lot of collectors are outliving their ability to protect their collection. Exactly what you just said. So I'm getting collections now mostly from collectors rather than their families. And this is very, very intriguing in that you say there may be a point in this, being cognizant of your role as a custodian, as you called it, there is a point where you start to get concerned that, can I really take care of these? Because I don't want to have the pain. And that goes all the way back to your original point, risk-taking versus risk aversion.
Right. This 108-year-old lady probably wasn't allowed to drive anymore.
No, she wasn't.
But she was allowed to have her collection.
But she was allowed to be surrounded by her dolls. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that makes the point, I think.
Yeah. Interesting.
We talked earlier about nostalgia, and there was a play on Broadway. Presumably it was about hoarding, but it really was about nostalgia. It was Danny DeVito's play called I Need That. And he collected many, many items after his wife died, simply because of nostalgia, I believe, rather than hoarding. As you know, 3% of collectors are hoarders, so they buy more than they can ever. Well, they don't really buy a lot of it. They just sometimes find it. It's not worth very much, but they pack their houses with it and people can't even walk through and the family is very distressed and so on. But I would like to ask you, is there ever a situation that someone hoards dolls?
Sure. We find it, and I want to talk to you about it because you actually address this in the book. And it is as you mentioned, a minority of the collectors, but you talked about it in your book that I don't like to use the word hoarding. I don't know why, because it has such negative connotations, but you actually define it as a diagnosis, if you will. Is the word a disorder?
It's organic, I believe.
Okay.
Yes, there's something wrong in the brain.
Okay. First of all, I like to call them accumulators. It sounds a little bit better. But you mentioned in your book how that's not collecting. They are actually not collectors. Right. So since we're on this subject, tell me what defines the difference? What is the separation?
One major difference is that collectors enjoy their collection. Hoarders do not. It just distresses them. Hoarders collect minor items like newspapers or safety pins or coins from the ground, even rocks. It has been known that some hoarders actually die when their pile of papers falls on them because they're buried alive, essentially. That has happened. That's been reported. So collectors generally keep their collection in a special place in the house, and they make it as beautiful and attractive as they can. Hoarders just put their items anywhere. There is a major difference. And I just found out the other day and wrote an article about this, that 20% of hoarders actually end up homeless because the city will evict them from their homes because animals get in their home with all of this garbage and so on.
It's interesting in that, in a sense, these accumulators should not even be talked about in the same light as collecting because it is vastly different, but it tends to be confused a lot, that the general public, the others, as I called them before, the 60% who don't collect, think anybody who collects is that. And that's where I think it gets really wrong. As you define it, an organized collection that is beautifully displayed and that is curated over time, that is a collector. That is not an accumulator. Yet I have seen collections like this of 2,000, 3,000 pieces in homes. Now, the family has said, oh, my mother is a hoarder or was a hoarder or something along those lines. And I'm like, No, this is not the case. She has a lot of things, that's for sure. But look, this is all very orderly. They're beautifully displayed in different areas of the house. There just happens to be a lot of them. And so you're saying that is different.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I think it's great to define that. And I think this is a great opportunity for people who don't collect to understand exactly the difference. And you give us the science behind it and understanding that the term hoarding and collecting should not be spoken necessarily in the same light. And collectors tend to get a bad rap as a result of what you call is the actual hoarding that's totally different. Really, I'm glad you touched on that. Thank you. So I want to interject something. Dr. Mueller, you've lived many lives within your life, and from a neurologist, scientist, to becoming a collector, and then later in life becoming a financial advisor. So you bring another set of tools into this conversation of collecting, in that your background in financial planning or financial advising. And you talk about in your book something that I was really interested in, and that's behavioral economics. And if I understand this right, it's weighing the emotions in buying and how they affect your decisions. Can you talk a little bit about behavioral economics? It was one of the most difficult things I had to read, I think, in the book to really try to understand it. So I'm hoping you can break it down in simple terms for us here.
Well, the difference between neuroeconomics and behavioral economics is that neuroeconomics has to do with something we can identify in the brain, most likely using magnetic resonance imaging to determine where specific locations relate to specific activity, where behavioral economics has to do with studies not involving imaging, but in a laboratory, for example, a psychology laboratory, where the neuroeconomics would be studied most often in a neurology setting or a scientific study where PhDs were coming into the neurology area. So to me, that's the major difference. Our behavior definitely affects our buying decisions. For example, we all like a bargain, so we go for a bargain. And that actually is affected by two areas, the neural and the behavioral. The neural, because it has been shown scientifically using functional MRI, but also behavioral because studies were done that indicate if given a choice, people will always choose the bargain. For example, a lady goes shopping and she sees a dress that she likes and there's another dress right by it that looks very similar. The price tag on one is $200 and the price tag on the other one is $75. She will generally choose the one that costs less. So that's a behavioral study. And the neuroeconomic study uses tools that are used in neurology and neuroscience.
And that is looking at some of the pleasure points in the brain to see how they react to certain moments, in this case, collecting. And getting a bargain, I guess, is a big one.
Yes.
Is that related to dopamine? Is it part of it?
Yes. Another dopamine hit if you get something at a discount or you think it's a discount.
Or does it affect collectors' decisions in a way? I mean, is there anything related advice you can give to collectors based on this study?
I would say if it's too good to be true, it probably is not what it is said to be. There's so much competition that you can see on the internet for a particular piece. But the problem is that the collector may buy a piece that is not what it's said to be if you buy on the internet. Okay,
so that's where I think we're hitting the moment of really understanding this. Ultimately, the behavioral economics is you want a bargain. And so your tendency as a collector may be to over-fixate on the bargain aspect of it when that is counterintuitive to getting what may be the best things.
Exactly. I can give an example of that. This would be maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But if anything I was bidding on was very expensive and I couldn't go to the auction and I couldn't see the piece, I would talk with one of my friends about giving me a report on the piece because I wouldn't want to waste my money on something that wasn't what it was said to be.
Fascinating stuff. Dr. Mueller, economic utility, another part of your book. And this was another moment of epiphany for me in understanding, even though I've worked with collectors all these years, the science behind the idea of collecting, why we collect. And you wrote something that really resonated with me, that collecting is about, and I put this in quotations, completing sets. Can you talk about that a little bit more and what you mean by this?
Of course, most collectors are inadvertently set collectors. For example, if I had 4 pieces of a garniture which was originally composed of 5 pieces, if I could find the 5th piece that was just like the 4 that I already had, that would delight me. And it would delight me for several reasons. One is it might increase the value of the set. Secondly, instead of a return on investment, I call it a return on social cues, because most people like to see a set rather than one. It gives them a social satisfaction. So that is the return, the social return that is obtained.
And I guess to clarify, it's not like the concept of a tea set and trying to complete that tea set. I guess that could be one way to complete a set, but it could be that you know that there are 40 different examples made by this one artist or company or whatever. And you're being able to get all of those in a line. That's one of the motivating aspects of collecting.
Right. To make it complete. Tea sets are a good example. In Chinese export porcelain, there are very few, if any, complete tea sets left because of breakage. But people still want to get as many pieces as they can of the same kind.
I'm trying to correlate it to dolls, and I guess it could be a number of different things. You have one company, Émile Jumeau, and you know all the different models in the 19th century that Émile Jumeau made in Paris at the time. And so your motivation as a collector, and I guess this drives what we call the hunt, which you've talked about in the book, that the hunt is a big part of the experience of collecting. The hunt is trying to find all of the different pieces from that Jumeau company.
Right.
And so we are set completers. It's another term for collecting. We are the completers of sets. And I guess that's telling a history and a story behind something that you focus in on in your collecting.
It excites me just when you talk about getting a set of these dolls. It'd be so satisfying. Really?
I can get you started in doll collecting very easily if you like. Actually, it can be an extension of your love of porcelain in that in Europe in 1820 to 1860s was an incredible movement of porcelain doll making by KPM, Royal Copenhagen, Jacob Petit in France. I can get you started on that, and it will correlate beautifully with your love of porcelain.
You are absolutely right. I've seen those dolls with the porcelain faces, and they're so beautiful.
I was also interested in, from the perspective of my own work, because I've seen it all the time, that there's actually, is the word a neuroscience behind that collectors will place a higher value on an item in their own collection versus the identical one in another collection. What is behind all that?
Well, I think if it's mine, it's always worth more compared to you, even if you have the same thing, because it is mine. That's the very reason that I assign a greater value to it. I think it's human nature. So
is there a science behind this, though? It's something that you studied that is the trigger to this? Or is it just, as you said, human nature?
I believe it's just human nature.
We see it all the time in the work. And it's so interesting because when they're buying it, they want to get it for the lowest possible price.
Oh, of course. Right.
And when they want to sell it, they want the world record price, and they think it's worth the world record price. And so it's just a natural tendency, but you helped put it down on paper for people to read, to understand this is a natural reaction that people are going to have. I guess from a collecting standpoint, it's something to take into account for a collector who's going into another collector's home. And that collector is touting their item as being the end-all, be-all and worth this and that, that collectors should be cautious in understanding that they're going to probably put a higher value on it because, as you say, it's theirs.
Right. This concept has actually helped me in selling some of my porcelain privately because I realized that, of course, I wanted a very high price, but I realized that if it was going to leave the house, I had to compromise. And I did. I was proud of myself. So I actually use that concept in my own life. in dealing with porcelain.
It allows you to be pragmatic to the realities out there and to put aside your personal feelings. You want to sell the object. Knowing this, understanding this allows you to be more realistic and actually get the job done of what you want to do. So it's great advice. You had a chapter and talked about something that I couldn't believe it, because I've talked about this in lectures for years in helping collectors and how to build great collections. And you called it the herding effect. You could call it the herd mentality or whatever. And I've long touted this idea in collecting as being a detriment to collectors who may be more budget constrained, and they still tend to follow the herd into markets that are really strong, really hot, because it feels comfortable there, because everybody's doing it. But then there's always certain segments in the doll market, if you will. We have many, many different genres and segments, and some of them will go through cold periods. And a lot of the collectors, especially if you're budget constrained, you want to go there, but they won't. They go into the fray of following these other collectors. So, Dr. Mueller, help me understand what is behind this herding effect. Can you explain it to me a little bit?
Every collector feels better if they're doing what other collectors are doing. It makes them feel as though they're in the crowd, in the right place, and doing the right thing. The astute collector will look for areas that are out of fashion for a couple reasons. One is, I think it can be more interesting. 2, the items can be less expensive. And 3, it gives them an edge when this area comes back into fashion again. So there are a few collectors like this in Chinese porcelain that I know, and their areas are so interesting because they're not like everybody else's, that they often are invited to speak about it and so on. So if you're brave enough, I would say, as a collector, go against the trend. Buy things that are out of fashion. Study them, and then when they come back into fashion, you will be the leader. The only problem with this, as I see it, is that it takes a long time for some things that are out of fashion to come back into fashion. They will, but if it takes 50 years and you're older, you may not see it.
But if you love them, what difference does it make?
It doesn't make any difference at all.
Exactly.
About 80% of collectors do it for love.
Right.
They really enjoy it. About 20% of investors collect for investment. And then they might not even choose what they're collecting themselves. They might hire somebody to do it.
Right.
So it's more of a cold transaction rather than a warm exchange with your heart involved.
So the herding effect, I guess this is another one we would call human nature, that you want to go where the crowd is going. And you help to identify this from, I guess, a clinical standpoint in allowing people to be self-aware of this, to give them the confidence to go outside the box, if you will, and to know that that's where you probably want to be in collecting. And you do it because you know that it is the natural tendency. So I just love so much in this book. It's incredible. But one of the things that I was really interested in having a discussion with you on collectibles and investing and how the mind works in relationship to this. You gave some examples of your own analysis of items that you've sold and what your investment return was. And you seem to really place an emphasis on the idea of these being an investment. Am I correct in that, or am I wrong?
Collectibles can be a good investment, no doubt about it. I think the 80% of collectors who collect for love don't care so much about that, maybe not at all. Some high net worth collectors, 20, 30 million and above, just want to make money, or some of them do collect for love. But in general, it's thought that 20% of collectors are doing it for investment. And they may, as I say, have other people choose their collectibles. They may keep them in a vault. They may not even keep them on their walls or on shelves. And then they just wait 10 years, 20 years for the items to increase in value, and then they sell them. Of course, because of inflation, most items will increase in value in time. So the thing is, if you're investing just to gain a return, you take these items out of circulation. If you put them in a vault or don't show them at all, which some people would consider a shame. that they're not utilized in the way they are intended, which is to be admired.
Let me just tell you my joke I always say at lectures, and that is that when collectors come up to me and they say, Stuart, what in dolls right now will be a really good investment? And I always tell them commercial real estate. And that is, go buy a piece of commercial real estate to house your collection, display it there. When it comes time to sell, you'll make more money on the commercial real estate than you will probably on the doll collection. So you really placed an emphasis on investment. And I think this is the one area that we might disagree on, where I actually encourage collectors to throw out completely the idea of investing. Forget about it and just buy things that ultimately they are great investments. That is, you have to admit that your Chinese porcelain has been giving you returns every single day. Every day you go up there and look at them. Every day you get to tell others the stories of them. Every day you get to share them. That's your investment. That's your return. What they sell for in the end, does it really matter? I mean, is there something, again, in the workings of the mind that this really, you think, matters to a collector?
Only certain collectors.
Interestingly enough, you pointed out something that I do agree with, that it is fascinating that it is the high wealth collectors who tend to be the most fixated on the idea of an investment. I've noticed this as well.
True.
Your bread and butter, everyday collectors like you and I, they're less fixated on that. And you think it would be the other way around.
Right. If there is a profit, of course, it's very nice, but that's not what 80% of the collectors think about when they buy their pieces.
Right.
They have an emotional attachment to their pieces, such that if they're lost, which we've already established, it feels so wrong. It feels like losing an arm or a leg. Mm-hmm. Some people even say it's like losing a child, but I think that's going a bit far.
That's going a bit too far, yeah, for sure. Right. But is there science behind this of why high wealth individuals tend to be the ones most fixated on the concept of investment?
Well, they're driven by money. Many of the high net worth individuals got there by being driven by money. And investing in art is just part of that, because in a diversified portfolio, usually no more than 5% of it should be in art, because when art goes up, other areas in the portfolio go down and so on. They balance each other. So studies have shown that it is good for people with a lot of money, 30 million and above, for their portfolio should have a small amount of art. And I think that's what they're doing, because their advisors are telling them that's what they should be doing.
Very, very interesting. And I was really excited to read this and hear your perspective on it and then have a chance to talk to you about it. So thank you. Kind of want to end this talk with asking you, as a collector, and everything that you have learned now, not just from your experiences in collecting, but all the studies you've done, scientific studies that you've done over these years in getting into the mind of a collector, if you could write a letter, let's say, to your younger collector self. In 1989, I think you told me you started. If you could write a letter to her to tell her what to do as a collector or everything you've learned, what would you say to her?
I would say two things. One, buy the best thing that you can, best item. And secondly, once you have that best item, if you are able to find something that's even better, then put aside the item you already have, sell it, so that you don't meet space constraints. People who just keep buying, they will have a lot of less important things in their possession, which are much harder to de-access than the top end in a collector's regimen, I would say.
What would you tell that younger self from a science perspective to be aware of in yourself as a collector? What would be the most important two things?
To realize that there is a part of your brain, the insula, that is wary of being deceived. And so using that to educate someone about the importance of leaving anything off the table if they have even the slightest idea in their mind that it might be a fake. It's better to err on the side, I think, generally of not buying something that you think might not be what it's said to be. Although occasionally people can veer away from this and if it's special enough and doesn't cost that much, even though they're not sure what it is, then buy it. This actually happened to me in Holland. I saw something that I'd never seen before, and it struck me as being authentic, but I wasn't sure. But what made me decide to buy it, since I'd never seen it before, was completely new to me, and I was a pretty seasoned collector, which meant it could be a fake, was the price, which was affordable. I could lose that money if I had to. And it turned out to be absolutely an enormous positive. It was a pair. One of the pair was shown on a ceiling that had been painted in a palace in Germany, the Charlottenburg Palace, in, I think it was like 1798. So the pieces were authentic, and I haven't seen any like except in royal collections, but not in private collections such as I have. That also just describes, I guess, how I make some of the time, hopefully all the time, informed decisions in spending my money.
So it all goes back to risk-taking again, which exactly. I really think is the underlying important thing for collectors to recognize in themselves. Balancing out that risk-taking with risk aversion. I think the concept of recognizing that the pain is real when you make a mistake or you have a loss, but to accept that and realize that comes with collecting and not become obsessed about it for long term. You've got to just accept that it is part of the experience of collecting and the joy of it. And you have brought so much clarity to this subject. And I really encourage people to get your book. Again, it's called Inside the Head of a Collector, Neuropsychological Forces at Play. Dr. Shirley Mueller is the author. And you can find it on Amazon or wherever. And as well, go online. And if you search out Dr. Mueller's name, you'll also find other articles she's written, interviews that she's done as well. And she brings so much clarity and so much insight into the collector's mind. And again, I think really assists us as collectors in recognizing what is part of our brain that is creating the need to collect, but as well showing us through the lessons that she's studied how we can control certain things to make ourselves better collectors and have a better time. And I love that you started it off, Dr. Mueller, with the idea of collecting is such a positive thing, because I do believe it is. And thank you for saying that as well as a professional. And I thank you for being here today.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.